everyone, I'm Mindy Wood from Our Inspired Roots, and I teach people how to homestead for better health. Today I'm here with Tessa Zundel to talk about preparing the garden for spring using a no-till gardening method. For those of you who don't know Tessa, she's a homesteader and blogger at homesteadlady.com, and she focuses on teaching self-sufficient living on any level. Thanks for being here, Tessa.
Of course, thanks for having me. I love to talk about gardening.
Yeah. So first I just wanted to tell the viewers what no-till gardening is for those who don't know. So no-till gardening is very basically, it's a way of gardening where you don't use plows or shovels or other ways of turning the soil. Instead, you use other strategies for fertilizing and aerating the soil. The benefit is that the soil structure stays intact and it produces a healthier garden. So let's get started with our questions. What have you noticed that is the biggest or most notable benefit for no-till gardening?
Well, bear in mind that I'm nearing 45. I'll be 45 this year. So my back has become a bigger issue than it was when I was 25. And so one of the biggest benefits for no-till gardening for me is that there's less laborious shoveling and wrenching out weeds. I was pretty gung-ho for all of that when I was 25, but not so much anymore. I have other hobbies throwing out my back. So I really appreciate about no-till gardening that it creates, there's so many layers of organic material in the soil that it's really friable, and that means it's loose, usually when everything's zen and your garden's just the way it should be. And you can just pull out weeds, and when you need to move dirt, you can do it with simple implements. There are times when that's not true, of course, but by and large, I spend a lot less time with a shovel and digging a lot. And that's a great benefit to me. And it has its benefits. One of the other things about no-till gardening is that you can, I actually got into it because of my budget. So I couldn't afford to keep buying pesticides and herbicides to control the things happening in my garden. And so I started to learn about something called integrated pest management, where you use certain plants to control your bug populations. And that led me into no-till gardening, or some people call it the lasagna method of creating good soil. There's all different names for it. Culture employs all of these principles. So if you're familiar with that phrase, you're already doing no-till gardening. But that's how I got started. I couldn't afford to keep throwing money. It was supposed to be saving me money, not taking all my money. And so that's another benefit. You create these systems that manage themselves, and you don't have to go broke growing tomatoes. You just get to eat tomatoes.
Right. Yeah, I think that is one of the biggest things for me. Is it really is just so much easier on your body. And
yeah. It matters. Your body matters.
Right. And then also, if you don't have a rototiller or a plow and you don't want to invest in those things, which a lot of backyard gardeners don't want to do that, it makes sense to do no-till. So have you ever started a garden from scratch using no-till methods? Have you done that at all?
Yes. Yes. So I have moved. I've lost track. I don't know. I've started homesteads at least 6, 7, maybe 8 times now. And so the first thing I start is a garden because, it's like with anything else, the foundation takes the longest, and you want to have a really good foundation in the garden. So yes, I've done it many times and in many different climates. I am from California, so nice West Coast, like 12-month growing season. No big deal to grow stuff there. I've done it in North Carolina, where there was humidity, high bug populations. Everything wants to eat your garden besides you. I mean, you kind of have to fight for stuff out of your garden. The soil is very acidic. And then, let's see, we lived in the Intermountain West in Utah, where it's very arid, very hot and dry. And now we're in Missouri. and it's very hot in the summers, very wet. Oh, anyway, so here we are in Missouri, and each of those places I've done the no-till method, and in each place it works. It just takes time. So one of the things, if you have lots and lots of capital that you want to throw at your garden, great, you can still use these methods. You just can go out and purchase whatever it is you need in the way of soil amendments like compost and wood chips and whatever it is you want to put down. I use cardboard because since I'm always moving, I always have cardboard boxes on hand. And so that's what I put down as my first layer. Some people use paper. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can use. So if you have that money and you want to invest in your garden, go ahead. That's fine. But if you don't, you can do it the cheap man's way and it works just fine. I testify, it works just fine. Mm-hmm. People shouldn't feel, especially if they're new gardeners, don't be intimidated by this method. It's actually easier than anything I've ever done. It's way simple. Believe me, if I can do it, you can do it.
Right?
Anybody can do it.
Yeah, I think that's true too. I actually did a no-till method one year, and I didn't want to wait like a whole year for it to.
Oh, you don't want to wait. You're a gardener.
So, yeah, right. So I just was like, well, I'll just see what happens, and it actually worked out. It was possibly better than any of the other gardens. So I think it's easy enough for anybody to do. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned lasagna gardening. So to tell the viewers really quick, that's like you layer things. You layer compost, you layer mulch, and some people do it like a very specific way. But I don't think you really have to be that specific about it as long as you have really good organic material. So what do you use for your layers, or how do you do that?
Okay, so for me, it's been area dependent. So wherever I'm living, whatever I can get cheaply or free is the best thing ever. That's what I'll use and I'll make it work. So, and first I should say, so I have this whole article on my site about homestead personalities, and it applies to gardeners too. Some of us are just very meticulous and we want a recipe. It makes us feel comfortable. So we follow, you know, like a lasagna, there's a recipe for how to do that kind of gardening. And it makes you happy to do it that way, and that's fine. I'm not that way. I'm not meticulous about anything. I'm just not, it's not in my nature. So if you are a meticulous sort of person listening to this and thinking, well, that's spastic, I can't do that. You can. Just go find any article or book that speaks to you about this method, and you can do it. There are rules to follow. Some people like those rules. I don't mind rules. I think they're great. I just forget about them and they don't translate into my regular life. Really, because like I said, I don't have a lot of money to throw at the garden. So I have to work with what I have. And that's a good skill to learn too. So for instance, when I lived in North Carolina, pine trees grow like weeds, and you probably have that in Virginia too. Mm-hmm. Like literally, when the first house we owned there, I think we had 140 trees and we lived on half an acre. And so we spent a lot of our time weeding out the trees like we would weed the garden. And so wood chippers are very prolific there. So you can rent one for very, very reasonable amount. So we would chip up our trees and we'd have a never-ending supply of wood mulch there. The pine needles that fell, again, very acidic, but we used them, whereas now I use straw as part of my top dressing. There I would use pine needles. And then I would compensate by adding more alkaline amendments here and there. But one thing I found, did I lose you again?
I can still hear you.
Okay. One of the things I found was that the plants actually typically adjust pretty well. And I think that's because there's so much else going on in the soil. So when I start out, I always put down cardboard because, like I said, I have a lot of it on hand typically. And it can be found cheaply in your community, even places like Walmart. You can go and beg free boxes. Your feed store always has them. And they're happy for you to take them away. Go take them away. So I put those down. And then, and people will talk about pulling off the tape. And And some people don't want to use cardboard because of the acid that's present in the creation of the cardboard, the processing, the cleaning. Again, I'm not that meticulous, but I get it. A lot of people get into no-till gardening because they're very concerned about the environment and want to reduce various kinds of impact and footprint, and that's great. If that's you, then you'll probably want to use something other than cardboard. There are paper mulches you can buy that don't have as much of that. Cardboard has a really high concentration of that. But that's what I use. So I start with cardboard. And then I put down a layer of native soil if I have it on hand. So right now where we are, the people before us had this huge pile of dirt type substance outside the barn. I'm sure it had horse manure and stuff from their animals that they left. And it had sat there long enough, I wasn't concerned about pathogens. So I grabbed the shovel and my teenagers and we wheelbarrowed it over. So we were putting in some fruit trees by the barn. And so we put that down. And one of the reasons why native soil is good to incorporate into your layers, I feel, is because it has natural immunity. So your soil's like your body. And if you feed it correctly with good things, it's going to have a really super strong immune system. Well, good native soil, especially some that has had some manure in it, has a really strong immune system. And it'll help your plants just get a strong foothold. And then I put, if I've got sand, I might throw in a little. I haven't lived in a place where I really need sand, so I don't use it that often. Mm-hmm. A bit in North Carolina, just because of my lot was so hard packed clay that I wanted to introduce a little bit of sand into the mix because things filter down. So the whole idea of this no-till method is that you're building up the soil with 6 to 12 inches of organic material and it breaks down. So you're improving your native soil down underneath, but you're also creating this beautiful top dressing. I call it the top dressing. It's like the salad dressing on your salad.
Right.
So sometimes I'll add in something like that. Some people add in somewhere towards this topish area, things like bone meal and other natural fertilizers, dung, animal manure will go somewhere up in here. And then I like to put in, like in North Carolina, I use the pine straw, but here I use wheat straw or whatever comes off my pasture. We have a pasture mix right now that we use. And I like to put it in there because it gives a lot of biomass. So it makes this huge fat layer with lots of air pockets. And that makes the little microbes that are in there eating everything down. It makes them really happy. In Missouri, we have torrential water that comes from the sky many times a year and sort of like it's feast or famine. We can't just have a nice little rain. It's and so the soil can get really waterlogged. And so I like having, it's very carbony. Straw is very, so if you're thinking about your compost, if you've ever read recipes about creating compost, got to have this much nitrogen, got to have this much carbon. And you don't want too much carbon or you basically starve your plants by feeding it one of too much of whichever of those things. And it's a lot of carbon, straw is. But I don't know, I throw in a bunch of other stuff too throughout the season. We can talk about cover crops if you want. That's one way to get good nitrogen in. So after I put my straw, I don't know, what do I do? I'm not very scientific, right? So it's like at least 4 inches, but I like to get more like 8 inches. That makes me happier. Where we live now, we have someone who bales our pasture, and so I get those big, huge round bales, and I just pull them off in sheets and put them down. When I lived in cities, we were purchasing wheat straw bales. In Utah, we did this a lot. Super cheap. They're like $3 for this huge, massive square bale, and it goes really far. The straw makes a good top dressing when you've planted. So say you put in your tomatoes and you want something to suppress weeds on the top. If you can't afford wood chips or you don't want to mess with the acidity or any of that, if you just want to use something nice and light, straw is really good. The problem is it breaks down super fast. So out west, the sun would disintegrate it to dust in like a month. So I had to replace it. But again, if it's not expensive where you are, then that's not a big deal. Here, I use it because I have a pasture. It's very convenient. Otherwise, those round bales are a little pricey, but I get them for free. So then I put down, so there's my straw. And then I put down, if I have it, I put down leaf mulch or any other kind of shredded bark, something that still has some mass to it, but is broken and ripped. The more you have surface area that's been exposed, so you wouldn't want to go out and put down wood planking on top of your garden because it's too smooth, it's too fine. It'll take forever to break down. So you want to expose all the edges and rip it up. And if you have a leaf shredder, that's fantastic. I don't have any fancy equipment. But those work great for tearing up leaves because they can get kind of sodden and like they strangle your plants because they're just all mashed together. And then on top, at least once a year, I'll put down wood chips. Now, wood chips are exhausting. They're heavy, and because it rains so much here, they're always wet and they're messy. And anyway, they're a pain in the butt. But I have teenagers for a reason. So I'm like, come on, teenagers, let's go get wood chips. Like, no, Mom, I choose life. No. But they help. That's what kids are good for. So at least once a year I put down wood chips, and they really do a lot of amazing things for the soil, for the garden, especially with weed suppression, but they also feed your soil in a very unique way. So I really like to get them on, but just because of my schedule, I usually only manage it once a year. So that's my very non-scientific way that I usually do things. And if I only have access to one of those things, or I only have time to do one of those things, then I do that. I would do it more often, but I'm busy. Everybody's busy. So you do what you can. I'll never forget the first time I read Toby Hemingway's book, Gaia's Garden, which is all about permaculture for normal people. It's written in human. And I love that book. I recommend it highly. But he said, recoined the old adage, overall, doing an imperfect something is better than doing a perfect nothing. And so if all I have time for is to grab some straw and throw it down, then that's what I do. If I can do all that other stuff, sweet, I get it done. When you're first establishing a garden, you do need all those layers. So if you don't get to one, make time and put another one on, because what you're doing is building the soil for the first time, and your foundation is so important. It can't be replaced. If you just kind of start, you'll end up frustrated and feel like, I can't garden. I can't grow food. It's too hard. I'm fighting the plants. I'm fighting the soil. Probably really it's just because the foundation didn't give it enough time. So if you must grow a tomato this season, I understand. I really do. But get a pot and throw it in a pot on your patio and grow the tomato and feed that need, but then go build your soil. Take all the time you need. It's just time. Take a season if that's what it requires for that first foundation. But then after that, it's like, whatever. Plants in my world have to thrive on benign neglect sometimes because I'm busy feeding the humans and I don't always have time for the garden the way I'd like. But so there's that. That's my very unscientific method. Do it all, except when you can't, do what you can.
Right. I think that's a really good point to make, because I think a lot of times people just get overwhelmed with like, I can't make sure that there's 8 inches of compost and then 4 or 8 inches of mulch, because that's a lot of stuff, especially if you're trying to make a big garden. So I think that's a good point, is that like, just whatever you can do, it will be something at least.
Right. Do it.
Okay, so how do you aerate the soil?
That's a good question. And I think, so when you're in like a backyard garden type setting, you can really work that setting. You can DIY it all the way. If you are even just using a hand trowel and lightly, so when I was in a city, I always do garden beds, even when I'm out. I don't know. I like to keep things tidy in a world of chaos, so I always have a bed. And if you just take your hand trowel and you're lightly disturbing just the first few inches of the soil to kind of break it up, and you can use your fingers, because if you've done your job right, your soil just doesn't compact the way it does in other gardens. It is really pretty loose, all things considered. So wear your garden gloves. My mother always says, wear your gloves, and I never do. And I'm sorry, now that I'm 45, I look like an old woman. No, I'm a gardener. So you stick your hands in there and you can move around whatever it is you need to move around. And if you're adding specific amendments like the bone meal, you really don't want to just flail that stuff around because that's expensive. So you can place it, hand place it in your beds and move it around, and you're not disturbing much that way. So in no-till gardening, the idea is that you created this beautiful structure like a little ladder of everywhere. There's all of these beautiful symbiotic relationships happening in that soil. So you don't want to, say, use a rototiller that goes in there even 6 to 12 inches and pulls stuff up. You don't want to keep pulling stuff up from the bottom. Right. You want like a top-down, trickle-down sort of a thing. And so you can do that in a backyard setting easily. Now, but if you're gardening in a big way, if you have like an acre garden, that's not very practical unless that's all you do like 40 hours a week is go with your little hand trowel along your. But if you're just in a backyard garden setting, you can do that. I have, if you want to upgrade from that and you don't like spending time on your knees, again, remember your body's important, you can get, there are various sorts of garden forks that you can use that are particularly, they're designed to not go as far as a pitchfork is like the tines are 8 to 12 inches. But they're called broad forks, and there are all these different sizes, and their tines are 6-ish inches, and they're bent. So they're actually designed, when you stick them in, they just pop up the soil just a little bit, and you can go down the rows like that. And those are very effective if you've got, more than a small garden, but you're still not talking about an acre's worth of garden to mess with. So backyard gardeners, you're totally fine. Just get your trowel.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've used a broad fork for a medium-sized garden, like you were saying, but for smaller ones, like the worms do a lot of aerating. Like you'd be surprised, they really do. So that's a good point, because I think a broad fork is like $200 for a decent one. So that's another. If you don't have the $200 to invest, you might
may not need it.
Well, I can't start a garden now, but you can. You can do it.
Right. Yeah. That's one of the things that took me by surprise the most when I started this method was, wait, I'm not having to dig. I was like, what do you don't dig? What's the option? Well, it turns out you really don't have to.
Right.
I like it.
Yes, it's so much easier. So you mentioned that you use straw, and you've also used wood chips and pretty much anything that's available.
Right.
Have you ever used hay?
What's that?
Have you ever used hay?
Yes, when it's old. In fact, we've got bales in there now. The alpacas are turning their nose up at because they're so last year. So it's alfalfa. So it's full of protein. It's still got some nitrogen in it. It's still kind of green. So I'll pull that out and give them some new stuff. Their Royal Highnesses. Alpacas are so fun. They keep distracting me. They're here in the field. They keep moving around. So yeah, you can use hay. It's just typically more expensive. But if you feel like you need a good concentration of some really healthy nitrogen for your soil and you don't want to mess with cover crops, get some alfalfa hay if somebody grows it near you, because it's great. It's nitrogen packed.
Nice.
Be careful. Just spread it. It's not like straw is kind of like, when you eat rice cakes, that's what straw is for your garden. It adds bulk and it fills up the soil, and it provides, like I said, for us out here, those air pockets are great. But it's not very nutritive. It's just a carbon. So nitrogen is really what's going to heavily feed, just spread it out.
So what do you do in the spring when you're prepping the garden for the coming growing season, or maybe even in the fall the year before?
Good question. So depends on if I'm moving. If it's a year where I'm moving, then I cry because I'm leaving my garden. But if the garden is still new, so I figure So Tasha Tudor once said that it takes about 12 years for a garden to look like it's always been there. And I feel you probably spend about 4 of those years really building up your soil to where you could just plant anything, as long as it, it needs to work in your climate. But so I don't rush the process anymore. So I'm really working on growing good dirt is really what I'm doing for at least 2 solid years. And so I repeat so the first year I do that process, cardboard and everything. The second year I typically repeat it, because a lot of what you're doing is weed suppression is a big deal for us here in Missouri, and anywhere where it's humid. So I bet you have this in Virginia as well. Mm-hmm. It wasn't quite as big a deal in the West, where it was a little drier. I don't know, it was just different. But here, it's like a huge part of what I do as a gardener is tell the weeds where I want them to be, because they're really not trying to do you any harm. They're actually in the soil trying to build it in the way that they think is best. You just happen to disagree philosophically with the weeds on how that can be accomplished. Right. So you're asking them nicely to go somewhere else, like into your pasture where your animals can eat them nicely, all that cool stuff. I just don't want it in my garden. So the next year I will come out again with my cardboard, and I'll just repeat the process, because I'm not done telling the weeds where they can get off. So I take another year and I do the whole process again. And I'll do that in the spring, and I wait. Like, if your weather is sketchy, like you were saying this year, it's really warm. I've actually heard that from a lot of people this year. Their winter is just really, really warm. Yeah. And I'm lulled into this sense of gardening security. Like, maybe I could get started now. Right. We're going to get hit with an Arctic blast. I just know we are. And so I'm not going to prune my trees early, and I'm not going to go out in the garden and do that, because the second you put that stuff down, the second Mother Nature is taking it apart. And so if you want it at a certain place for your garden plantings, you want it partially broken down, but not all the way, because you still want that nice stuff around. Don't go too early. So like, I won't actually do any of that until I'm going to be really strong. I'm going to wait till March and do it. Usually the rule is, for me, whenever my soil is workable. So if you go out and you grab a handful of soil and you swoosh it, first of all, if you can pick it up, if it's not frozen, that's a good sign. But if you squeeze it and water's running down your arm, you definitely don't want to plant in it yet. But you start putting down your layers. So every year I always put down straw. I always put down leaves if I have them. I always put down manure from the barn, which has been composted over the season. So this is what I do in the spring. And then I'll put, like I said, I'll do my wood chips once a year. I usually do them in the spring. So I do that every year, but I don't typically mess with the cardboard unless I have to. And I don't reintroduce native soil unless I feel like the bed is struggling with bugs and stuff like that. I have to weed out grubs. We have most garden insects spend it's like 75% of them spend some part of their life cycle in the soil. So if you are going to put native soil in your beds, just kind of filter, but look around for grubs and any beetly type things you just don't want to toss them to your chickens. But I don't usually introduce native soil again unless my bed is struggling for some reason and I think it needs a little boost. There are other things I do first, like compost tea amendments and companion growing, cover crop growing, because I don't like to haul dirt. It's too heavy. I just don't like to do it. So I don't do it unless I have to. So that's what I do in the spring. And then I'll put down a layer of cover crops, some kind of legume usually, something that I just want to grow up and then kill and put it back into the soil. And that's all I really do in the spring. And then in the fall, it depends on how behind I am for Christmas. So if in the fall I have scheduled my time correctly and I have a week or so to work in the garden, I'll put on a layer of mulch because we have lots of trees. So this is my leaf time. I gather it, I put it down, and then I put, ideally I'm putting on another layer of wood chips, but probably I'm being a wuss and I just go get my straw. Whatever. I'm not picky. So that's mostly what I do in the fall, unless I'm dealing with perennials need a little bit of extra food for the winter and stuff like that. but I don't typically mess with. Usually in the middle of the growing season, I find compost tea is a little easier to feed the plants with than hauling around compost. So I usually only haul compost once or twice a year. The animals probably wish I would do it more often. Alpacas are very, very ladylike.
Do you remove old plants? Because I know that
I
some
do.
people will just leave them, or some people will still take them out.
Right. I take out my tomatoes because tomatoes are like bug magnets in my experience. Take them out and we burn them. I don't mess around.
Yeah.
But they're the only ones I punish with extreme prejudice. Most of the rest of them, any leafy green thing, even the weeds that happen to pop up here and there, I just pull them out and lay them down. In fact, my kids are trained. They'll ask, Mom, is this a lay down plant after we pull it, or is this a take it out plant? Like, lay it down, kid.
Right.
Because it's all. And the cool thing about weeds is that they're excellent scavengers. So you pull out a radish and its little root is just that big. Oh, look at the cute little radish. And then you take it. They pull out pigweed or something. That root has gone down this far. It's an overachiever as far as scavenging goes. So they're not bad to have top dressing your soil. You just don't want them competing for nutrients with your plants. So you do pull them and then usually just lay them down. But tomatoes, tomatoes, anything in the nightshade family. So potato greens, all of that, pepper greens. But like if I cull my herbs or trim my herbs or any of my perennials, I just lay them down. Even if they're woody plants, it all builds organic layer. So yeah, I guess tomatoes are the only thing. Eggplants, yeah, anything in that nightshade family, pull it out of there. Unless you live in a place where bugs don't bother them. But I've never lived in a place like that, so.
Right. Yes. So if you have just one piece of advice to give people about prepping their garden in the spring or starting a new garden using the no-till method, what would you say that is?
Do it. Don't wait for the stars to align. Don't wait for your mother-in-law to approve. Don't wait for the kids to want a garden. Don't wait. Just do it. Of all of the methods that are out there, like I did square foot gardening. I was I didn't know anything. I was in my late teens when I started gardening seriously, and I just used what my grandparents had done, conventional, digging in the dirt. And then finally got tired of that, and I transferred to the square foot gardening, which was way too much math for me. It was just too much. And all of the soil, it worked really well, but it was too much. Of all of the things I've tried, this method is the easiest. It's so simple. Just think of your garden as you're tucking it into bed. Just putting down a layer, putting down a blanket, give it a little pillow, give it some nighttime tea and say goodnight. And it'll be fine. It'll perform for you. And give it time. I mean, it may not be stellar your first year. If you don't know what you're doing, that's okay. But I think just start. This is your year. Write that on your refrigerator. This is my year. I'm going to do it this year. And I'm not going to worry about whether or not it's perfect.
Yeah.
So that's my advice. Just do it.
That's great. Well, Tessa, thank you so much for your wisdom. I've learned a lot, and I know that everyone else is going to really enjoy this conversation.
Good.
If you're watching this video on YouTube, you can find the full version in the Our Inspired Roots Academy, and I'll link to that in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.